harbor as Captain Sarah Storm Martinez adjusted the worn leather strap of her weathered duffel bag, her calloused hands gripping the dock's wooden planks as she prepared to board her vessel. The Sovereign Grace, a modest 42-foot sport fisher that had seen better decades, bobbed gently in the choppy waters of San Diego Bay, her hull bearing the scars of countless voyages and adventures that most people could only dream of experiencing. To the casual observer, Sarah appeared to be just another weekend warrior preparing for a fishing expedition, her sun-bleached hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her faded jeans and salt-stained windbreaker giving her the appearance of someone who had spent more time battling the elements than sitting behind a desk in some sterile office building. But appearances, as Sarah had learned through 15 years of classified operations in some of the world's most dangerous waters, could be devastatingly deceptive. Beneath her unassuming exterior lay a mind sharp enough to cut through diplomatic red tape and a body trained to endure conditions that would break most people before they even realized what they were facing. Her muscles, though lean, carried, the kind of functional strength that came from hauling herself up cargo nets in the middle of typhoons and rappelling down helicopter lines into hostile territory where a single mistake could mean the difference between mission success and international incident. The Sovereign Grace had been her sanctuary for the past 3 years, ever since she'd quietly resigned from her position as a lieutenant commander in Naval Special Warfare Development Group, a unit so classified that most people didn't even know it existed, and those who did were bound by oaths that made traditional NDAs look like casual suggestions. The boat had cost her nearly every penny of her military savings, but it represented something far more valuable than money. Freedom from the endless debriefings, the psychological evaluations that probed into corners of her mind she preferred to keep locked away, and the crushing weight of secrets that had accumulated like barnacles on her soul over the course of her career. She'd purchased the vessel from a retired commercial fisherman named Miguel, who had spent 40 years hauling in everything from yellowfin tuna to the occasional bale of suspicious cargo that the authorities pretended not to notice as long as nobody got hurt and the paperwork remained properly filed. Miguel had taken one look at Sarah's bearing, the way she moved with unconscious tactical awareness even in the relaxed environment of the marina, and had knocked $5,000 off the asking price without being asked. "You've got the look," he'd said simply, his weathered face creasing into a knowing smile. The water calls to people like us differently than it does to the weekend warriors. Now, as Sarah methodically checked her equipment and prepared for what was supposed to be a simple day of solitary fishing in international waters, she felt the familiar tingle of unease that had kept her alive through missions in the Persian Gulf, the South China Sea, and waters so classified that their names were redacted even in her own memories. The harbor seemed unusually quiet for a Saturday morning, with fewer boats than normal preparing for departure, and the dock workers moved with a subtle tension that reminded her of the minutes before a coordinated assault began. Her instincts, honed by years of operating in environments where paranoia was a survival skill rather than a personality disorder, told her that something was off about this particular morning. The way the seagulls seemed more agitated than usual, circling overhead in patterns that spoke of disruption rather than the lazy hunting flights she'd grown accustomed to observing. The subtle changes in the rhythm of the harbor's morning routine, the absence of familiar faces among the marina staff, the way conversations seemed to die just a little too quickly when she passed within earshot, all of it combined to create a symphony of wrongness that made the hair on the back of her neck stand at attention. As she started the Sovereign Grace's engine, feeling the familiar rumble of the twin diesels coming to life beneath her feet, Sarah caught sight of a coast guard cutter positioned just outside the harbor entrance, its white hull gleaming in the morning sun like a predator lying in wait. The vessel was larger than the usual patrol boats that monitored the area, and its positioning was tactically sound for interdicting vessels leaving the harbor, exactly the kind of setup she would have recommended if she were planning an operation to intercept specific maritime traffic. But Sarah Martinez was no longer Lieutenant Commander Martinez, and her days of analyzing tactical situations for military briefings were behind her. She was simply a civilian now, A woman seeking solitude on the open ocean with nothing more dangerous than a tackle box full of fishing lures and a cooler stocked with sandwiches and cold beer. At least, that's what her carefully maintained cover story would tell anyone who bothered to ask, and it was a story she'd practiced until it felt as natural as breathing. The irony wasn't lost on her that after spending years hunting targets across international waters, she now found herself, potentially, becoming someone else's quarry. As she guided the Sovereign Grace away from the dock and toward the harbor entrance, Sarah felt the familiar weight of concealed weapons she no longer officially carried, heard the whisper of training that never truly left someone who'd spent years operating in the shadows where governments pretended their hands remained clean while their operators did the work that kept democracy functioning in an increasingly complex world. Whatever was waiting for her beyond the harbor entrance, Sarah Martinez was ready to face it with the same calm professionalism that had earned her commendations that would never see the light of day and the respect of teammates whose names were carved into memorials that officially didn't exist. The only question now was whether her past would stay buried beneath the waves where she'd left it, or if the tide was finally bringing her secrets back to shore. The Coast Guard cutter. Vigilant moved with predatory precision as Sarah cleared the harbor mouth, its crew executing a textbook intercept pattern that immediately told her this was no random inspection. The vessel's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander James Reeves, stood rigid on the bridge with his binoculars trained on her modest fishing boat, his jaw set in the kind of determined grimace that Sarah recognized from her own mirror during the darkest days of her military service. Behind him, 6 heavily armed boarding team members checked their equipment with the methodical efficiency of professionals who had done this dance countless times before, their tactical vests bulging with restraints, weapons, and the kind of detection equipment that suggested they were looking for something far more serious than unlicensed fishing gear. Fishing vessel Sovereign Grace, this is United States Coast Guard cutter Vigilant. The radio crackled with official authority that brooked no argument. Heave to immediately and prepare to be boarded for mandatory safety inspection and customs verification. Failure to comply will result in the use of force and seizure of your vessel under federal maritime law. Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward the hidden compartment beneath the helm, where her service pistol lay wrapped in waterproof canvas, then stopped as years of training reminded her that drawing a weapon on federal agents would transform the situation from complicated to catastrophic in the span of a heartbeat. Instead, she reached for the radio microphone with deliberate calm, her voice carrying the kind of steady authority that came from years of communicating in crisis situations where panic could kill everyone involved. Coast Guard Vigilant, this is Sovereign Grace. I'm complying with your request and reducing speed. Please advise the nature of this inspection. The response came not through official channels but through the distinctive whine of approaching Zodiac inflatables, their powerful outboard engines cutting through the morning chop as they surrounded her vessel in a formation that was decidedly military rather than law enforcement. Sarah counted 8 boarding team members split between 2 boats, each carrying enough firepower to stop a small smuggling operation, their faces hidden behind tactical sunglasses and the kind of professional anonymity that government agencies used when they wanted to avoid awkward questions later. As the first Zodiac pulled alongside her starboard rail, Sarah found herself face-to-face with Petty Officer First Class Marcus Chen, whose muscular frame and alert posture immediately marked him as someone accustomed to dangerous work. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, the same hypervigilant scanning pattern she'd seen in the mirror during her own operational years, constantly assessing threats and escape routes even in seemingly routine situations. These weren't typical Coast Guard inspectors conducting random safety checks. These were operators conducting a targeted interdiction based on specific intelligence that someone had fed them about her activities. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step away from the helm and keep your hands visible at all times," Chen announced as he swung aboard with practiced ease, his partner immediately moving to secure the vessel's engine controls while 2 more team members began a systematic search that was far too thorough for any routine inspection. We have credible intelligence suggesting this vessel may be involved in the transportation of contraband materials across international boundaries, and we're authorized to conduct a comprehensive search and seizure operation if necessary." Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities as she complied with their instructions, her hands raised in clear view, while her eyes tracked the movements of each team member with the kind of tactical awareness that never truly faded once it had been burned into someone's neural pathways. She knew her boat was clean, had kept it meticulously free of anything that could be construed as suspicious since the day she'd purchased it, but she also knew that intelligence agencies had ways of manufacturing evidence when they needed to justify actions that couldn't be explained through official channels. The search progressed with military precision, each team member covering specific sectors of the boat while maintaining clear lines of fire and communication. They were looking for something specific, their movements too focused and purposeful for a random inspection, and Sarah felt a cold knot forming in her stomach as she realized that her carefully constructed civilian life might be unraveling faster than a poorly tied bowline in a hurricane. When Petty Officer Chen discovered the hidden compartment containing her service weapon, his reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of the excitement she'd expected from finding contraband, his face showed the kind of professional concern that came from realizing a situation was far more complicated than the briefing had suggested. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification," Chen said, his voice carrying a new note of uncertainty as he examined the pristine Sig Sauer P226 and the worn leather holster that bore the subtle markings of someone who had carried weapons professionally for years rather than as a casual hobby. "This weapon appears to be military issue, and the modifications suggest professional use. Can you explain why you're carrying it aboard this vessel?" It was then that Sarah made the decision that would change everything, reaching slowly into her back pocket to retrieve the worn leather wallet that contained documents she'd hoped never to use again. Her fingers found the small plastic card nestled behind her driver's license, its surface bearing the kind of holographic security features that were impossible to forge and dangerous to possess without authorization. As she handed the card to Chen, she watched his expression change from professional suspicion to something approaching shock, his eyes widening as he processed information that clearly hadn't been included in his operational briefing. The card identified her as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, United States Navy, with a security clearance level that made most military personnel uncomfortable just knowing it existed. But it was the small notation in the lower right corner that made Chen's hand tremble almost imperceptibly as he studied the document. A simple code that identified her as a former member of DevGru, the Navy's most elite counterterrorism unit, a group so secretive that acknowledging its existence in the wrong company could end careers and compromise ongoing operations around the globe. "Jesus Christ," Chen whispered, forgetting protocol as the implications of his discovery crashed over him like a rogue wave. "Ma'am, we weren't told. Nobody said anything about—" He looked around frantically at his team members who were still conducting their search with professional thoroughness, unaware that they had just boarded the vessel of someone who had spent years conducting the kind of operations that made their current mission look like a training exercise for summer camp counselors. But Sarah's moment of relief was short-lived, because as Chen struggled to process this new information, she caught sight of something that made her blood run cold with the kind of terror that came from recognizing a threat that went far beyond simple law enforcement complications. Moving between the Coast Guard team members with practiced invisibility was a figure she recognized despite 3 years of trying to forget every detail of his face. Viktor Kozlov, a former Spetsnaz operative who had supposedly died in a Black Sea operation that had never officially happened, now wearing the uniform of a Coast Guard intelligence specialist and carrying equipment that definitely wasn't standard issue for maritime law enforcement. "Now we can speak honestly," Kozlov said, producing a weapon that was definitely not Coast Guard issue, its sleek profile and advanced optics marking it as the kind of equipment that intelligence agencies denied owning while their operators carried it into situations that never officially happened. Your government has something that belongs to my employers, and you, dear Commander, are going to help me retrieve it, whether you cooperate willingly or whether I have to persuade you through methods that will leave your Coast Guard friends with nightmares they'll never be able to discuss with their therapists. Time seemed to crystallize into slow motion as Sarah watched Viktor Kozlov separate himself from the Coast Guard team, his movements carrying the predatory grace of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of violence in the name of conflicting national interests. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from their last encounter in the frigid waters off Crimea, remained as pronounced as ever, a pale line against his weathered skin that served as a permanent reminder of the explosive device she'd detonated just close enough to mark him, but not close enough to finish the job she'd been sent to complete. Petty Officer Chen, still holding her identification with hands that trembled slightly from the revelation of her true background, found himself caught between conflicting loyalties as he watched the supposed intelligence specialist approach with an intensity that made every instinct scream warnings about imminent danger. "Ma'am," Chen whispered urgently, his voice barely audible above the sound of waves lapping against the hull. "I don't know what's happening here, but something feels very wrong about this whole operation. We were told this was a routine interdiction based on suspicious financial transactions, but nobody mentioned anything about Special Forces personnel or whatever this is turning into." Sarah's mind calculated angles and distances with automatic precision, her years of tactical training creating a three-dimensional map of the boat's layout and identifying potential weapons, escape routes, and defensive positions even as she maintained the appearance of cooperative compliance. The other Coast Guard team members continued their search with professional thoroughness, apparently unaware that their colleague wasn't who he claimed to be, their genuine dedication to duty making them unwitting participants in what was rapidly revealing itself to be an elaborate deception orchestrated by someone with access to classified intelligence and the resources to manipulate legitimate law enforcement operations. "Lieutenant Commander Martinez," Kozlov said in accented English that carried undertones of Arctic winds and vodka-soaked nights in Moscow briefing rooms, his smile as cold and sharp as the blade she remembered him wielding with lethal expertise in hand-to-hand combat. Or should I say, former Lieutenant Commander? I must admit, when my sources informed me that the infamous Storm Martinez had purchased a fishing boat and was living quietly in San Diego, I initially dismissed the intelligence as too convenient to be credible. Surely someone of your capabilities would choose a more sophisticated method of disappearing from the world stage. The revelation that he knew her operational call sign sent ice through Sarah's veins, because Storm wasn't just classified, it was compartmentalized at levels that required presidential authorization to access, known only to a handful of people who held security clearances that came with lifetime monitoring and the kind of background investigations that could uncover secrets buried deeper than nuclear waste. Someone had betrayed her location and identity. But more disturbing was the realization that Kozlov's presence here meant that the network of enemy operatives she'd spent years dismantling had not only survived her efforts, but had evolved into something far more dangerous and sophisticated than she'd ever imagined. "I see you're wondering how I survived our last encounter," Kozlov continued, gesturing casually toward the scar that marked his face like a battle ribbon he wore with perverse pride. "The explosion you triggered in the shipping container was quite spectacular, I'll admit. For several minutes, I genuinely believed I was going to die in those freezing waters, watching my blood mix with the Black Sea while debris from the arms shipment rained down around me like metallic snow. But you made one crucial mistake, Commander. You assumed that someone like me would die easily, when in fact people like us are remarkably difficult to kill permanently." Chen's radio crackled with incoming communications from the Coast Guard cutter, his commanding officer demanding status updates on the search and seizure operation. But the young petty officer found himself paralyzed by the growing realization that he was witnessing something far beyond his training or authorization level. The conversation happening before him involved classified operations, foreign agents, and the kind of international intrigue that existed only in spy novels and classified briefing documents that people like him were never meant to see. Yet here, he was holding identification that proved the woman they were investigating was exactly the kind of person who made such operations reality rather than fiction. Sarah's tactical assessment of the situation continued to evolve as she noticed subtle details that painted an increasingly grim picture of her circumstances. The other Coast Guard team members, while genuine in their service, were clearly operating under false pretenses, conducting their search with the kind of thoroughness that suggested they believed they were looking for drugs or weapons smuggling, rather than participating in what amounted to an assassination operation disguised as law enforcement. Kozlov had somehow infiltrated their ranks using credentials sophisticated enough to pass Coast Guard security screening, which meant he had backing from an organization with resources that rivaled those of major intelligence agencies. The arms dealers you eliminated in Sevastopol were more important than your briefings indicated, Kozlov explained with the casual tone of someone discussing weather patterns rather than international terrorism, his hands moving with deceptive casualness toward equipment that Sarah now realized wasn't standard Coast Guard issue. They weren't just selling weapons to Chechen separatists, they were the primary supply line for a network that extended far beyond regional conflicts, reaching into the heart of operations that your government would prefer to keep buried beneath. Layers of plausible deniability and congressional oversight committees that ask the wrong questions. The pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place as Sarah processed this information, her memory retrieving details from that final mission that she'd tried to suppress through 3 years of fishing and solitude. The shipping container she destroyed hadn't just contained small arms and explosives. The intelligence reports had mentioned prototype communication equipment, advanced surveillance technology, and financial records that could have exposed funding networks spanning multiple continents and involving players whose names appeared in newspaper headlines rather than classified target lists. But it was Chen's sudden movement toward his service weapon that triggered the next phase of the confrontation, the young petty officer's training finally overriding his confusion as he recognized that the man claiming to be a Coast Guard intelligence specialist was speaking with intimate knowledge of classified operations that no legitimate agent would discuss in front of witnesses. "Sir, I'm going to need you to identify yourself properly and explain how you have access to this information," Chen announced with admirable courage, his hand resting on his sidearm while his eyes darted between Sarah and Kozlov like a referee, trying to maintain control of a sporting event that was rapidly devolving into a blood sport. Kozlov's response was swift and professionally brutal, his movement so fluid that Sarah almost missed the microsecond transition from casual conversation to lethal action. The sound of Chen's body hitting the deck was muffled by the boat's engine noise, but the sight of the young man's unconscious form sprawled across the fishing gear sent Sarah's training into full activation mode, muscle memory overriding conscious thought as she dove toward the hidden compartment where her weapon waited like a faithful friend she'd hoped never to see again. The other Coast Guard team members, genuine professionals caught completely off guard by the sudden violence erupting on what they'd believed was a routine interdiction, found themselves torn between their training to protect their fellow service members and their confusion about who represented the actual threat in a situation that had spiraled beyond their understanding in the span of seconds. Their hesitation would prove costly, because Sarah Martinez wasn't just any former Special Forces operator. She was someone who had spent years learning to fight her way out of impossible situations against opponents who were every bit as skilled and ruthless as the man now standing over Chen's unconscious body with the satisfied expression of a predator who had successfully isolated his prey. "Now we can speak honestly," Kozlov said, producing a weapon that was definitely not Coast Guard issue, its sleek profile and advanced optics marking it as the kind of equipment that intelligence agencies denied owning while their operators carried it into situations that never officially happened. "Your government has something that belongs to my employers, and you, dear Commander, are going to help me retrieve it, whether you cooperate willingly or whether I have to persuade you through methods that will leave your Coast Guard friends with nightmares they'll never be able to discuss with their therapists." What happened next defied every expectation Kozlov had carefully constructed during months of planning and surveillance, because Sarah Martinez wasn't the broken veteran he'd assumed would crumble under pressure after years of civilian softness. Instead, she moved with the fluid lethality of someone whose muscle memory had been forged in crucibles that transformed ordinary humans into weapons of surgical precision, her hand finding the concealed pistol in one smooth motion while her body twisted into a defensive position that minimized her target profile and maximized her ability to engage multiple threats simultaneously. The first shot rang out across the water with the sharp crack of professional violence, Sarah's bullet finding the radio equipment that connected the boarding team to their command vessel, ensuring that whatever happened next would occur without immediate backup or oversight from the legitimate Coast Guard personnel who remained, unaware that their operation had been compromised by forces operating far beyond their clearance level. The second shot, fired less than a heartbeat later, destroyed Kozlov's exotic weapon before he could bring it to bear, sending fragments of advanced electronics and precision metal cascading across the deck like deadly confetti. "Chen, stay down," Sarah barked, her voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that made the unconscious petty officer instinctively curl into a protective position even in his stunned state, while the other Coast Guard team members found themselves caught in a nightmare scenario where their training provided no guidance for determining who represented the actual threat to American security. "Everyone else, weapons on the deck now. You're good people caught in a bad situation, and I don't want to hurt anyone who's just trying to do their job." But Kozlov wasn't finished, his years of Spetsnaz training asserting itself as he rolled behind the boat's fishing equipment, using the confusion and the presence of innocent Coast Guard personnel as human shields, while he calculated angles and options with the cold precision of someone who had survived similar situations by embracing brutality that others couldn't stomach. "You always were too sentimental about collateral damage, Storm," he called out, his voice carrying across the deck with mocking familiarity. "It's what made you predictable in Sevastopol, and it's what will make you dead here in your precious American waters." The revelation that stunned everyone, Sarah included, came not from Kozlov but from Petty Officer Chen, who struggled to his feet with blood trickling from his scalp and reached into his tactical vest to produce identification that bore the unmistakable seal of naval intelligence, his earlier confusion and fear replaced by the grim determination of someone whose cover had been blown but whose mission remained paramount. "Actually, Victor," Chen said, his voice now carrying traces of accent that marked him as something other than the all-American sailor he'd appeared to be moments before. "The predictable one here is you." The young man Sarah had assumed was an innocent Coast Guard petty officer caught in circumstances beyond his understanding was revealed to be Senior Chief Intelligence Specialist Marcus Chanvolkov, a deep-cover operative whose mixed Russian-Chinese heritage had made him invaluable for penetrating the exact network that Kozlov represented, his assignment to this Coast Guard unit serving as the perfect cover for an operation that had been years in the making. The unconsciousness had been expertly feigned, his apparent injury nothing more than theatrical blood applied with the skill of someone trained in deception at levels that made Hollywood special effects look amateur by comparison. "Sarah, I apologize for the deception, but we've been tracking Kozlov's network for 18 months, Chen explained rapidly, his transformation from confused young sailor to seasoned intelligence operative so complete that Sarah wondered how she'd missed the signs that were now glaringly obvious in hindsight. "Your Sevastopol operation didn't just disrupt an arms-dealing network. It exposed a broader conspiracy involving stolen American military technology that's been making its way to state actors who shouldn't have access to systems that could compromise our national security at levels you can't imagine." The other Coast Guard team members, genuine personnel who found themselves witnesses to revelations that would require extensive debriefing and possibly memory modification protocols, struggled to process the reality that their routine law enforcement operation had become the stage for a counterintelligence drama involving multiple layers of deception, foreign agents, and classified technology that existed in the shadowy margins where official government policy met the brutal necessities of international espionage. Kozlov's laughter echoed across the water with the bitter humor of someone who had spent years accepting that death was an occupational hazard rather than a distant possibility. His position behind the fishing equipment providing temporary cover, but no real protection against two operators whose combined skills represented decades of training in exactly this type of close-quarters combat scenario. Magnificent! A family reunion on the high seas, he announced with theatrical appreciation for the irony of the situation. The legendary Storm Martinez, the ghost who supposedly died in Crimea, and now the revelation that American intelligence has been playing a longer game than even I anticipated. But Sarah's mind was already processing the tactical implications of Chen's revelation, because if he was naval intelligence conducting a long-term operation against Kozlov's network, then her presence here wasn't coincidental. She'd been manipulated into position as carefully as any chess piece, her boat and her retirement serving as the perfect bait to draw Kozlov into American waters where he could be captured or eliminated without the diplomatic complications that would arise from conducting operations in foreign territory. The realization that she'd been used, that her carefully constructed peaceful existence had been nothing more than an extended undercover operation she hadn't even known she was participating in, filled her with a fury that burned hotter than the Mediterranean sun during her worst missions. The prototype communication array from Sevastopol, Chen continued, his weapon now trained on Kozlov's position, while his eyes maintained the kind of tactical awareness that came from years of operations where a moment's inattention could prove fatal. It wasn't destroyed in the explosion like our reports indicated. Your government recovered it intact and has been reverse engineering technology that could revolutionize submarine warfare, satellite communications, and maritime surveillance in ways that would shift the balance of naval power for decades to come. The truth hit Sarah like a rogue wave she hadn't seen coming, because she remembered with crystalline clarity the moment in that Crimean warehouse when she'd hesitated for just an instant before triggering the explosive charges, her hand hovering over the detonator as she'd noticed technical specifications on equipment that seemed far too advanced for the black market arms dealers they were supposedly targeting. That hesitation, which she'd attributed to professional thoroughness in ensuring complete destruction of the facility, had actually been her subconscious recognition that the mission parameters hadn't matched the actual strategic value of what they were destroying. But Kozlov wasn't finished revealing the extent of the conspiracy that had shaped both their lives for the past 3 years, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had discovered truths that made simple patriotism seem naively inadequate for navigating the complexities of modern international relations. What your intelligence specialist hasn't told you, dear Storm, is that the technology you helped steal was originally Russian innovation that had been acquired through a previous American operation, making this entire elaborate dance nothing more than powerful nations playing keep away with weapons that could make conventional naval warfare obsolete within a generation. The philosophical implications of learning that she'd spent years fighting proxy wars over technology that had already changed hands multiple times through operations conducted by agencies that claimed moral authority while engaging in activities that would scandalize the citizens they claimed to protect, struck Sarah with the force of a revelation that threatened to undermine everything she'd believed about duty, honor, and the righteousness of the cause she'd served with unwavering dedication. As the standoff intensified with multiple weapons trained on multiple targets, she realized that the most dangerous enemy she faced wasn't Kozlov or even the shadowy network he represented. It was the growing understanding that in the world of international espionage, there were no heroes, only different levels of necessary evil, and she'd been both perpetrator and victim of a system that consumed its own operators as readily as it eliminated its designated enemies.